human rights and supply chains. I'm your host, Åsa Borssén from Raw Talks. If you haven't heard of Raw Talks, we're an online interview series. We interview brilliant minds and thinkers and share their knowledge in videos online, and you will see a few clips from such interviews here today. The world is moving towards a low-carbon future, and with that comes a need for raw materials. And the conditions under which these green tech materials are mined has drawn much attention and media coverage. We've all seen the media stories on child labor. And increasingly, consumers of these materials, that is car or phone manufacturers, are being held responsible for something that happens far down the supply chain. And they lack typically the information to ensure good labor and environmental standards. And we are here to discuss what role can human rights play in installing strong compliance procedures along mineral supply chains. But my role is not to answer that, but to ask the relevant questions to our eminent panel here. We have in the middle, Chats. He has an interdisciplinary development background with a focus on natural resources issues in DRC, which is relevant for many reasons. And is currently PACT's program manager for sustainable livelihoods in its Mines to Markets program, which I'm sure we will hear more about during the session. Then at the end, we have Joshua Lutz. He's head of the Business and Human Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights, based in the Faculty of Law of the University of Pretoria. He's worked with a number of international organizations, development banks, government, civil society, industry organizations, and not least companies. And last but not least, to my immediate right here is John Stuntz, a former colleague of mine, now manager of the Extractives and Development Program at the Federal Institute for Geoscience and Natural Resources, BGR, and a human rights champion within that organization. Before we launch into the discussion, let me briefly explain to you the rules of the game. We've divided the discussion into 3 sections, and each section will be preceded by a clip from a Raw Talks interview. And this will spur discussion amongst our panel. And the last 15 minutes, we will open up for questions from the audience, and maybe we will get something from Twitter as well. Andrew will keep us posted. Great, thank you. So with that, let us begin.
A significant chapter in this energy transition story will be our ability to store the electricity, and hence the capacity of batteries will be crucial. How are we doing?
What we're seeing is this symbiosis between electric vehicles and grid storage or battery storage. And that makes us somewhat confident that lithium-ion batteries in particular are going to play an important role, because they have this advantage of the cost declines being driven by a completely different industry for completely different reasons. So those battery cost declines are going to play into the stationary storage market. Lithium-ion batteries are really good at getting to a peak really fast. Now, where they're not good at is long duration. So batteries, lithium-ion batteries, enjoying the cost declines associated with electric vehicles, are going to play an important role in helping balance the short term to the intraday. They may play some role a little bit longer, but it gets expensive. You need a really big battery to discharge over a long period of time. When we get to high penetrations, you've still got a seasonal problem. So if you wanted to go all renewable, the question is, well, how do you generate to meet your evening winter peak, say here in the UK, when it's not windy and there's no solar? And it's been like that for 3 or 4 days and it's winter. Now that's a big challenge. It's not at us yet, and there are a number of technologies that help deliver that, but I think our expectation is that engineers are good at solving problems, and this is essentially an engineering problem.
So thank you, Seb. Why I wanted to start with this clip is because a lot of this is about batteries and the minerals needed for batteries, and cobalt in particular. We heard in the clip that batteries is central to the energy transition, and cobalt is central to the batteries discussion. And when it comes to cobalt, DRC is central to that discussion. Benjamin, you work now in DRC, and we hear a lot of stories of what is happening in the DRC. Can you tell me what is actually the situation in the country and on the ground?
Sure, many thanks. Yeah, PACT, we work in the DRC. We've worked there for the past 15 years on mining-related issues across different supply chains. We were working extensively on copper and cobalt in artisanal mining communities in the Copper Belt last decade. And then we subsequently became more involved in the 3 Ts, tin, tungsten, and tantalum, with the advent of the Dodd-Frank Act and OECD due diligence guidance. We are the field implementer for the ITSCI system, which is the International Tin Supply Chain Initiative. And since the report published by Amnesty International and AfroWatch in 2016, attention has been refocused, obviously, on cobalt, but really by association copper as well, since they're typically mined together. So the situation on the ground, I would say, unfortunately, remains similar to what was initially reported a few years ago by Amnesty International and AfroWatch, which is, of course, receiving more attention because of the factors at play, the market factors, the demand for cobalt. But of course, it's been a strategic mineral, and as has copper for decades. And so, of course, we do continue to see throughout the Copper Belt extensive instances of child labor, of environmental degradation, of corruption tied to the supply chain, as well as displacement of residential communities. And these are issues, some of them at least, that don't exclusively concern artisanal and small-scale mining, but are also linked to large-scale mining. I think it's important, though, to note that artisanal and small-scale mining, where the child labor is really the most apparent, is a voluntary activity for the most part. Of course, there are exceptions. There are instances of forced labor, of what would constitute modern slavery. But by and large, it's a voluntary activity. Families, often accompanied by children, are working in the sector because they make more income than they do in alternative fields such as agriculture. So I think this is really important to note. So while these problems exist, there are some initiatives underway. There are at least 4 responsible sourcing projects related to artisanal and small-scale mining of cobalt in the Copper Belt. While we'd like to see things move a lot faster, there is some notable engagement, both on that side of responsible sourcing, so we would call that formalization of artisanal and small-scale mining. We're involved in a project with Trafigura and Shemaf, the mine operator, at a site called Mutoshi outside Kolwezi, where there are 6,000 artisanal mine workers who are working in a controlled area where access is controlled, where occupational health and safety standards are monitored, and where there have been significant investments made to improve them. But unfortunately, this is still the exception rather than the norm. But I think that our message, our leading message, would be engagement to improve the sector, particularly ASM, but also large-scale mining and their community impacts, rather than disengagement.
Mm-hmm. And what role does the program Mines to Market play?
So our Mines to Markets program essentially brings together all of the work we do related to mining around the world. We work in about 10 countries. Our mission is driven by the fact that although mining is the unsustainable use of non-renewable resources, it is precisely because of this that we need to try to leverage it for economic, social, and institutional development for its limited duration. And so we work on this through a variety of programs, from our conflict minerals program, the ITSCI traceability system, to our work in child labor and mining, as well as formalization, but also, for example, working on the voluntary principles on security and human rights, so training security forces at mine sites. We work on microfinance programs in mining communities. So really a pretty broad set of interventions that are aimed at leveraging the sector for local development.
Thank you. Human rights is sort of, that was supply chain side maybe, or the start of the supply chain, and human rights is the other element in the session here. And I want to turn to you, Joshua, because I think that human rights is a word that has been thrown around a lot, but it might be something that is, people might not really understand that well. So if you would elaborate a little bit on whose responsibility is it to prevent human rights abuses in situations such as the cobalt mines?
Sure, thank you very much. I think when it comes to the question around human rights responsibilities, there are a couple of things at play here. First and foremost, we need to remember that there are essentially two different human rights legal systems. The one being the international human rights legal system, the other one the domestic one. And the reason why that's important to understand is because each of these systems could and would most likely apply in all situations at the same time. And each of these systems elaborate about the human rights obligations and responsibilities of government, but as well as non-state actors, including the private sector, and increasingly doing so. So, for example, at the international human rights level, over the last 20, 30, 40 years maybe, since the 1980s, there's been a big push, especially by developing countries, to try and understand better what are the human rights obligations and responsibilities of the private sector. And we've seen some of this trickle down into the domestic legal frameworks as well. So, for example, the South African Constitution explicitly mentions that there's a horizontal application of human rights, but you don't see a lot of constitutions doing that. So a lot of people turn their attention to the international legal system to try and answer some of these questions about whose obligations and whose responsibilities it is to for example, fulfill human rights or respect human rights. Where we stand at the moment is that in 2011, the United Nations adopted what is called the UN, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, the UNGPs, as it's referred to sometimes. And even though it has been controversial in some instances, it does try and put forward the current consensus around obligations of different actors when it comes to human rights. The three basic pillars that the UNGPs rest on is the state duty to protect. So it recognizes that the state has a positive as well as a negative duty in the context of human rights. It mentions that there's a corporate responsibility to respect, so acknowledging that there is a negative duty, essentially, on companies to make sure that their activities and actions don't infringe on the human rights of others. And then the third pillar is called access remedy pillar. So that acknowledges the obligation that everybody collectively has to provide access remedy for victims of corporate human rights abuse. So under the UNGPs, when you ask a question like whose responsibility it is to prevent human rights violations from occurring, I think the most immediate and apparent answer would be that the state definitely has a very strong obligation to make sure that human rights violations do not occur. This could typically be through providing the correct domestic legal framework to ensure that private actors, through whatever they do not infringe on the human rights of others. And this could simply be by complying with domestic legal requirements. But the reality is that the international legal framework also requires companies to respect human rights, so they need to do the proper due diligence to ensure that whatever activities they're doing also do not violate the human rights of the people surrounding their activities. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying that it's a collective responsibility in many ways. When it comes to human rights responsibilities, I think it's very difficult to say that it's only one or the other that has a certain responsibility. When it comes to the specific context and the situation in question, I think there are different responsibilities tied to different actors. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
What can you say about how far it stretches down the supply chain? So there's one thing maybe if you're operating in a country, and one thing if you're a car manufacturer far down the supply chain with no actual operations in that country.
Yeah. So another important thing, and this is I think often where people miss the plot a little bit when it comes to the conversation around human rights, is that first and foremost we need to remember that even though it's a normative framework in which the law is embedded, human rights are legal obligations, right? It is a legal requirement. In fact, in most jurisdictions it is part of the Bill of Rights, which is typically embedded in the Constitution, so it's not only part of the law, it's part of the supreme law of most countries. And that's to say that most other laws need to be in compliance with the human rights requirements of that specific jurisdiction. So it's a legal responsibility that you can't get rid of, you can't pass it on. In the context of supply chain management, it's something that could typically be carried up all the way upstream, all the way downstream. So, even though it is hard, and I know that you mentioned in the introduction or the background to the session that often actors lack the information they need to ensure compliance with these things. I don't fully buy that, to be very honest. I think we live in an age where not having information is a very hard excuse to use. I mean, if I really wanted to, I could probably find out what all of you had for breakfast this morning, just through some internet searches. So telling people that you don't have the information that you need, I think it's not easy to sell, I think. So ensuring human rights compliance throughout your supply chain, I don't think it's impossible. And we've seen some companies do this very well. So if you think back, for example, I know it's a separate industry, but if you think back to the Nike child labor scandal in the early 2000s, for example, and again, there had to be some financial consequences in that instance before they decided to address the issue. But they did a relatively good job in addressing it, and they made sure that throughout the entire supply chain, the issue of child labor was addressed, and they did this through auditing, through contract requirements. So it is something that I think all companies should be very aware of, and that they should try and ensure throughout the entire supply chain. And there are tools available to help them do that for sure.
I have many more questions, but let me jump to Johannes. You're a manager of a development cooperation program. How is this issue of interest to you?
Thank you so much for this question. Thank you to you guys as well. I took more notes already now than I've brought into the session, so I also have a lot more questions actually. Let me try to look at this from two sides. I think there's an internal purpose of human rights that we live, and that comes from a principle that at least German development cooperation works upon. That is that everything that we do basically needs to be in principle human rights oriented. And that has a number of applications, for instance, in project assessments. So when we set up something completely new, we have to have a risk assessments, but also we have to check that all the activities that we do in the field do have at least follow do no harm principle, but ideally also have a relevance to realizing human rights, to frame it positively, which I think is quite important. The crucial question, of course, is how do you implement that? And that's kind of our role as a sector project also. How do you mainstream human rights in an entire portfolio that is development cooperation in the extractives? And that's something that we have at least tried to apply our minds on in the last couple of years, and provide some guidance also for the projects out there who are busy working on their daily challenges and busy actually implementing the activities that are fundamentally about mining, right? About technical questions in mining, and then it is sometimes difficult for them to keep human rights in mind basically all the time for whatever they do. So they need some sort of structure and some sort of assistance internally, and this is what we've been trying to do, or continuing to try and do at the moment. And then part two, and that is sort of the external thing that's happening at the moment, is of course, and that was mentioned clearly in the video, that is the current attention that the entire supply chain issue receives, and where we do see that new actors from the field of industry who are newcomers. And so I don't agree completely with that information deficit argument that you brought in. They are newcomers to that field. We have industry players who are now for the first time thinking of where their resources are actually coming from. And I think that will require some time, and that will require a bit of exchange until they get there to adjust their compliance mechanisms in a way that it actually works for responsible supply chains. I want to end with a question, or maybe an uncertainty that I have. Jojo just mentioned that there's this collective responsibility that includes us as development cooperation agencies, that includes academia, that includes also industry players. The human rights work that we've done so far was, as I said in the beginning, very much focused on internal procedures. I'm not entirely sure yet, given that these new actors come into that sphere. I'm not entirely sure where our place is and how our relation will be with these actors. What we can actually contribute to a development that we welcome. We want to see industry players think more about human rights in supply chains. We want to encourage that. I don't have a clear picture yet what our role will be in that, if that's more a role of a corporation, if that's actively driving that development, or yeah, what we will be in that respect.
Is there anyone who want to give in a quick comment on that, or because we can come back to it, but if you want to give a quick comment now, maybe Joshua.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. So just mention the information thing for sure. I think we agree more than you think. What I meant with that is, if you don't have the information, in my mind, it's either one of two things. Somebody's either trying to cover up information, or there's not a general interest in getting that information. So for sure, I think if you come into a specific sector as a new role player and you don't have the information, but you have the willpower to get that information, I think there are very few barriers to get that information. So I just wanted to clarify that. I think in terms of what development institutions can do to help facilitate better respect for human rights, and I think there is a lesson to learn here from development finance institutions, for example. So they make their assistance conditional, right? And I know you guys are doing this or have done this, and it's increasingly being done around the world as well, where you say that in order for us to cooperate on a certain project, or in order for you to receive the assistance that you're looking for, you need to make sure that there's respect for human rights. And I think, even though that might be a relatively hard requirement in the beginning, I do think that that is the way you get people to the table, to start and slowly but surely incorporating these things into their business model in general. So you see a lot of the development banks, for example, making their loans conditional for respect for human rights, etc. And as such, it creates this culture, essentially, where it becomes part of the modus operandi in general.
Ben, can I just ask you about the information issue, or the debate between these two gentlemen? How easy is it to get the real information for what is happening in the DRC, in the ASM mines, for example?
I think it does depend to some extent on the commodity. I think that initially it may have been more difficult in the 3 Ts to get information because of the remoteness of some of the areas, but I think that's changed a great deal. With the ITSD system, we publish information on every transport route, really all the way up to the mine, and incidents that we record based on OECD guidance. I think with cobalt and copper, it's interesting because if you listen to some industry representatives, when they describe the process of going through their entire supply chains, especially when you look at automotives, whose supply chains are actually significantly more complex than consumer electronics, a lot of the complexity really comes from the mid-tier sort of segment of the supply chain, whereas the risks we're discussing are really mostly in the upstream segment of the supply chain. And so if you look at cobalt and copper, particularly cobalt, because so much of it comes from the DRC, and not only from the DRC, but from an area of the DRC. I'm trying to think of a good geographic reference for everyone here, but for example, in the area between Paris and Brussels is essentially the area in the DRC, that distance where cobalt is mined. And so because of the concentration of that upstream supply chain, I think that companies, many companies who are not particularly engaged, I'm not sure about the informational aspect, but starting from there and then moving into actually engaging in risk mitigation, I think the purport, based on the number of companies that use cobalt, it's unfortunately quite small, so they could be doing a much better job.
Great, thank you. We will move into the next section.
With this shifting production, what do you see the geopolitical impact being? Who are the winners and the losers?
Well, I think the impact depends on the market in question. So if we consider, for example, cobalt, where supply is very heavily centred in the DRC or in Zambia, and there are relatively limited potential to substitute away from some of these materials, potentially the tensions around access to resources and the price at which they are purchased could be very real indeed. And we see, for example, automakers around the world already in talks with the miners and some of the suppliers of these key raw materials for longer term contracts to try and manage some of these risks. So there's certainly potential for tension and there's potential for real resource rents. Now, how these are allocated is anyone's guess, but unfortunately I think history tells that oftentimes it's the major buyers with market power that are able to enjoy some of these rents. Now, thinking about lithium, for example, it's somewhat different. It's a much less scarce resource and it's distributed much more diffusely around the world, including in both developed and developing markets. So in that sense, I think the pressure for rents, the pressure for appropriating resources and ensuring their control are somewhat lower.
Thank you, Ben. Two things to take away from that. We mentioned it before, but cobalt is extremely concentrated in DRC. So there are some risks of shortage of supply, for example, for companies. And also what he mentions, what is being done, precautionary measures taken, for example, from the car manufacturing industry, which is interesting. They are now, in some cases, talking directly to the miners to secure supply for their industry. But Ben, I want to start with you again. You mentioned 3T and G, that these are conflict minerals, which has some implications on what regulations are applicable, etc. So Dodd-Frank is about conflict minerals, for example, but cobalt is not. Why is that, and what are the implications for that?
Sure. Well, 3TG, so tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, are considered conflict minerals essentially because they were legislated to be conflict minerals by the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act. It has created several implications. One being that it has, on the positive side, it has compelled upstream industry, to some extent industry as a whole, to fairly closely follow OECD due diligence guidance when it comes to these minerals from the DRC. And that is positive. But I think that it does create the false impression that the risk profile is completely distinct from other minerals. For example, most of the conflict-related risks that you'll find in at least 3Ts, because even though gold is legislated as a conflict mineral, it's practically speaking because of the small amounts that can be carried really without a specialized transportation infrastructure. It's difficult to regulate or conduct due diligence on it in the same way that one does with 3Ts. So I'll mainly address 3Ts. And in that sense, most of the conflict-related risks, while there are some really notable, perhaps more conventional conflict-related risks in terms of armed groups in some parts of the Kivus, and there have been at times in northern Katanga and Maniema in the DRC, most areas where ITSC is operating in 3T areas, the risk is tied to illegal payments to security sector actors, including in the military or law enforcement. They tend, for the most part, at least currently, not to concern large-scale armed conflict in mines or long transport routes. Similarly, you have the same risk of illegal payments to security sector actors in cobalt and copper, and as you do with many other minerals in many other countries. And I think it makes the point that the way that companies should really be going about it, instead of us stigmatizing a lot of other minerals, perhaps arbitrarily, by calling them conflict minerals, is to apply OECD due diligence guidance to all conflict-affected or high-risk areas. And I'm hopeful that with the Responsible Minerals Initiative and the Global Battery Alliance and Responsible Cobalt Initiative increasingly focused on standards for responsible sourcing in cobalt, that could offer a model for other commodities to do the same without needing to legislate it and stigmatize particular geographies and particular commodities.
Joshua, looking at it in general, when companies are doing due diligences on different topics, but how can human rights be a tool to avoid both legal and reputational risks?
Yeah, so firstly maybe to focus on the latter, right, the reputational risk issue. I think in a lot of the conversations around human rights, due diligence, respect for human rights, the idea of using or avoiding reputational risk as an impetus for human rights respect is quite problematic for many people. The main reason being that for a lot of companies, especially those that doesn't necessarily deal directly with the public, that are not publicly listed, etc., that maybe don't rely as much on having a good reputation in the public eye. This idea of using reputational risk as a driving force to comply with human rights standards or respect for human rights is problematic. I mean, it is useful, of course, in some instances, but in some instances that can be problematic. Nonetheless, as you've mentioned, and I said earlier as well, human rights is part of the law. It's legal obligations, and that should be everything you need to convince you to comply with it, right? There are different reasons why I think human rights could be a good motivation or tool to be used to avoid certain risks. As in the legal consequences, for example, of violating human rights. I mean, we've seen companies, the private sector, especially in the mining industry, actually, and ironically again, especially in this country, in South Africa, you see a lot of litigation happening in the human rights space. I think human rights and constitutional litigation is maturing in a lot of different jurisdictions around the world. You increasingly see people, companies, even company directors being taken to court in civil as well as criminal lawsuits as a result of human rights violations. So first and foremost, I think to avoid those kind of consequences, you need to ensure that you comply with the requirements that are out there, the legal requirements. And then there's also, I think, the positive driving factors behind it. So, for example, in the context of supply chain, especially when it starts becoming procurement requirements with respect to human rights, then there's obviously some positive motivations behind compliance as well. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Ben, can I ask you, in your programs and the initiatives that you are mentioning, how do you use human rights in those? Is that one of the tools for you?
Yeah, I mean, human rights is, I think, alongside our recognition of the sector's contribution to development, human rights are central. We look at human rights risks, that's really the guiding principle in terms of how we implement the ITSC system, and also our work in the cobalt supply chain and in communities. All the human rights risks that have been highlighted extensively in the media around this supply chain, as well as in international norms. You could run through all those issues, and those either constitute incidents in the case of the ITSC supply chain, in which case the ITSC system, in which case we formed local stakeholder committees, multi-stakeholder committees of government, industry, and civil society in order to identify the risks, address the risks, mitigate them. And in the case of cobalt, I would describe child labor as really the most prominent human rights risk, but that's also because of the media and advocacy coverage of the supply chain. So the risk profiles are actually not so dissimilar between cobalt, copper, and 3Ts, but because of the different impetuses for action, they've led to some different responses. But child labor, certainly in our programming, we're really looking to implement solutions that enable children to sustainably withdraw from mining. That doesn't mean that they're simply banned from the mine. Of course, that's in the case of controlled access to formalized sites. That is an important intervention, but there also needs to be action taken to make sure that the children who are no longer working in mining are not put in a more precarious position through loss of income. So it's kind of on that side that we look to address that risk.
Johannes, how have you been working on human rights risk analysis so far?
Right. maybe one comment before I get into that, just building on what you guys said. Funding for development cooperation follows public attention, and that can be, and in the extractive sector you can see that visibly, what that does to the project portfolio that builds up over time. The BGR, for instance, has been working in the DRC on the same issues, I think, that you were also tackling, on formalization of artisanal and small-scale mining, on certifying trading chains, also together with the Secretariat of the Great Lakes region, and has been doing so for probably about 10 years or so now. And this clearly comes out of that attention that the Dodd-Frank Act also raised towards conflict minerals. That's the reason for this. So in a sense, we've been working on this. We've never framed it as such, but we've been working on human rights in that respect quite a lot. But again, that comes out of a public attention for conflict minerals, and as you have rightly said, I couldn't agree more. It excludes some of the very dominant human rights risks that we see out there that are just not so popular, that have no advocacy going on for them. Just thinking about construction minerals, for instance, where we have a massive child labor problem in a few countries in Africa. Nobody really cares about that. It goes away completely unnoticed, and there's no funding available for it, full stop, right? So that's I mean, on a broader scale, that is certainly an issue where development cooperation as a whole, I think, does not really live up to its expectations to tackle human rights as a holistic thing, right? Internally, again, it does look a bit differently. We've been going about human rights risks with a massive study I brought here with me in 2016. And that came out of the observation that there's a massive amount, obviously, of human rights literature on mining out there. But most of it is biased in some way, because it's written either by geologists who then writes about human rights, or of a human rights lawyer that then writes about geology, which never really made sense. Much of the literature, as you probably all know, is politically biased in one direction or the other, and that was a difficult base for us to build on and to establish a risk mitigation system for internal procedures. So we spent quite a bit of time with the Max Planck Foundation in Germany, who brought in the expertise on international law and human rights, and tried to develop a framework together that will basically go through the mine life cycle in a country and assess the human rights risks depending on the production that we will see and the processing facilities that we will see, and then basically break everything down in the most descriptive way and bias-free way possible, although that's probably never realistic to actually do that. Anyway, so that was our approach to basically create a framework, a methodology for risk assessment and for risk mitigation, and we're offering that sort of as, again, from a sector view to our bilateral projects as an element of support, because we realize that not every project on the ground will be able to do that and to do a proper risk mitigation system and establish that. We do offer that for them, offer quality control and something that they can just draw on when they go into project planning or look into their activities if they comply with our human rights principles.
Ben, a question, what do you see as the biggest challenge today for complying with human rights for suppliers in the supply chain?
That's a pretty broad question. I think the biggest challenge might be the fact that a lot of users of cobalt, downstream users particularly, they waver on, or they're unsure of what their response should be to these issues that have been highlighted. And that partly comes down to the distinction between ASM, or perceived kind of red flag sources of supply, as opposed to the large-scale mining that supposedly has less risks, fewer risks associated with it. I think that the reality is more complex. If you think about the large-scale mining concessions in the DRC, most concessions, most mining concessions in general, are large-scale concessions. The artisanal concessions, designated artisanal concessions, the ZEAs, tend to be poorly mapped. The ore is not as accessible. So most mining, whether it's artisanal or if it's large scale, is happening on large scale concessions. And so the question that we ask, or we want to be asked more frequently, and including among companies focused on mitigating human rights risks, is, well, under what conditions is it optimal from a human rights perspective for that work to be done? And is it better for it to be done illicitly and to handle it essentially as a security problem, where you're constantly playing kind of cat and mouse games between security and artisanal miners, including children, or whether it's simply tolerated but there isn't a commercial agreement on the concession, or if it's actually formalized, and in which case we believe that that's the optimal case, because that provides the conditions for investment in improving the standards of artisanal mining, and particularly occupational safety and health. So I think that companies are afraid to engage significantly with ASM because they feel like it puts them, they're kind of out on a ledge. They could be the focus of a media report that accuses them perhaps in not a fully informed way of being associated with serious risks that are specific to ASM. But really, if they consider the full context, ASM is going to happen regardless. And as people in academia, as well as intergovernmental organizations, international norms make clear, the best approach to it as an economic development engine and in order to mitigate human rights risks is to engage with it, not to disengage from the supply chain.
And with that, we're going to move into a final section, which is sort of a forward-looking.
Simple question. I wouldn't like to take any long-term bets on this because there's a lot of things changing. But our view is that by 2040 plus, you're going to see a system that is dominated by renewable technologies, particularly wind and solar, making up 2/3 of capacity, with fossil fuels sort of filling in the gaps. You're going to see a system that's increasingly distributed. So consumers are playing a much bigger role. Maybe they're trading peer-to-peer. Maybe they're being aggregated up and being traded in the market as well. Or maybe they just happen to own battery in a PV system. I think we're going to see a system where transportation is increasingly electric, and it's going to become a bit old-fashioned to have an internal combustion engine. And people are increasingly going to want the new model of the electric one. And it's going to become affordable and likely to be the cheapest thing that you can buy. So I think that this energy system is on the cusp of dramatic change. The renewable technologies that are going to facilitate that are mature, or are maturing at a rate at which you can see these crossovers in their economics happening much earlier than we anticipated even a year ago. And I think that offers huge challenges for the incumbent industries and great opportunities for new industries and new players to become part of the energy system of the future.
Why I wanted to play that clip is just to set the scenario for what we're to expect. He says for the energy market, this development is going to continue. And if you look at the cobalt, for example, in particular, there's some estimations from Roskilde that by 2027, the demand has grown to 310 tons from today's 118. And out of those 310,000, of course, 240,000 is a demand from batteries. So this discussion is just going to grow. And the question is then, what do we see for a human rights risk approach? Let me start, Joshua. Based on what you've heard today, based on what you've read so far on these issues, do you see human rights being the right approach to supply chains, due diligence in the future?
Yes.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Moving on.
yeah, I mean, yes, it is, for sure. I don't think it's the only thing. Like, of course, it doesn't. I don't think anybody would expect human rights to be the only lens through which you look at human supply chain due diligence. But The reality is that, and I think Ben has mentioned or highlighted as well, is that there are certain inherent human rights risks attached to supply chain management, especially in this sector, right? I am concerned about how you're going to pick up on those issues if you don't apply specific human rights focus to the due diligence that you're doing. This kind of reminds me a lot about the debate around impact assessment. So it's a space that I've worked in a little bit as well, and there's always this question on people's minds as to, given the fact that we have good environmental and social impact assessment frameworks that's been developed, what is the value add that human rights impact assessment, for example, could add to this equation, right? I think you can somehow apply that to the question around due diligence and supply chain as well. The thing is that experiences showed us that not all human rights issues are adequately captured by existing frameworks around environmental and social impact assessments. And unfortunately, the kind of issues that are often missed by these frameworks are extremely important ones and things with very, very dire consequences. So in order to stop those gaps, you need to apply a human rights lens to those issues. And I think the same could be said in the context of due diligence for supply chain management. Another question I think that a lot of industry actors especially have on their minds when it comes to human rights in the context of these issues is, why would I willingly take on something that is not necessarily required by law, right? So, for example, if you operate in a certain legal environment where human rights due diligence is not required in your activities, let's say supply chain management or otherwise, then why would a company willingly take on that responsibility, which could have financial consequences, etc.? The reality is, though, that if we lived in an ideal world, right, governments would take these international legal responsibilities and duties that they have serious enough to the extent that it's covered by domestic legal frameworks. In other words, the domestic legal framework would be detailed enough that if the private sector complied with what is required in the domestic legal framework, then they wouldn't have to worry about anything else. The reality is that this doesn't happen. Domestic legal frameworks are shortcoming when it comes to specific human rights obligations of the state and whoever operates in that state. And because a lot of these companies operate across borders as well, the multinational aspect also comes in. So the private sector needs to take on some of those responsibilities themselves in order to protect themselves, right, from the reputational and legal risks that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, so that's a long way of saying, yes, I think a human rights lens would be wise to apply to supply chain management, and a few other aspects of operation as well.
Johannes was sort of starting with an open question about what the role of development agencies can be. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier about the power of conditionality around assistance, etc. I think where we do often see a system like that failing, though, is the monitoring and the evaluation of compliance, right? So let's say the development organization make it a condition to respect human rights when you want to use their assistance. The problem often comes in, we've made this requirement, how do we know that this requirement is being met? And again, I think there are some examples that one could look at. The World Bank, for example, if non-compliance takes place or happens, people can bring complaints to mechanisms like the inspection panel and others. I know that some development agencies, again, have some of these mechanisms in place, but I think it could be useful for the agencies themselves to make this widespread practice, where there's a very clearly defined avenue that one can use to bring to their attention when compliance is not met. So I think the two of them together could maybe improve respect for compliance.
Johannes, Germany has a massive industry, and not least car industry. How do you see working with the German car industry in the future?
That is a very good question. I've had a few discussions lately where I always mention probably we're not going to see the BMW or the Fairtrade logo at the back. It's probably nothing that we can hope for, and so the consumer focus mechanism that might work well with Fairtrade coffee or chocolate might not really work for cars, essentially. And as was mentioned before, also the entire supply chain is so complex that you can't really create these unique levers that then take care of all of us, right? So it's not going to be so easy. We do welcome, and I said this before, we do welcome companies like BMW and Daimler very much to now move into that entire field and really applying their minds on human rights, what it means and what it means for the supply chain, because that is certainly a new thing. I'm not entirely sure what our role role would be. You are, I think, in an interesting position because you have a certain set of experience to bring into the conversation that comes from the established risk analysis and risk mitigation systems that we have. Up until now, we have basically never really thought of making this an external thing or recommend that to external players to apply, but maybe that is the way that it can go. I think it is quite a thin line though, because obviously we don't want to act as a greenwashing facility for industry. Also, we need to keep our own mandate. We need to act as equal and credible partners also to the industry, and that might be something that we have to figure out how we do that best. And in that respect, my feeling is that with all these sustainability initiatives that pop up now in these days for basically every metal that is or every mineral that is available, I think for a lot of industry players that is joining these initiatives is also a way of trying to avoid substantially dealing with the issue and basically building a barrier of security and also of risk mitigation certainly around them so that they are not directly exposed to risk mitigation questions that can be quite exhausting, especially in a supply chain that will procure cobalt from the DRC. So yeah, I mean, it will be really interesting to see how the industry perspective also develops over the next 1 or 2 years. If all these sustainability initiatives that have popped up now, if they actually survive the next 2 or 3 years, and how they will position themselves, what they will do in terms of methodology, and how they will implement that. So we're happy to share our views on this, our experiences, and find our place in that rather complex and hopefully holistic scenario.
Ben, you mentioned the project that it's quite a new one with Trafigura, and they're a commodity trader and quite a new actor in this responsible sourcing initiatives. Do you see increasingly other actors coming together for these kind of initiatives?
I think with cobalt, the space is pretty dynamic currently. I think the advocacy and the media around the issue has thrust some important actors into doing something. I think that, as with a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives, coordination can be difficult, and so the actual work in the field is not particularly large right now. But I think a lot of these actors, like Trafigura, who've been instrumental in forming these multi-stakeholder initiatives, if the rest of the membership takes a bit of time and if it takes a bit of time to coordinate them around particular activities, the leaders at the forefront have been doing projects on the ground. We have downstream technology partners who are funding child labor and mining interventions, such as Apple and Google and Microsoft. And we also have some large-scale miners, like Eurasian Resources Group, who are starting the same thing. Yeah, if I could also touch actually on this point about international development corporations, what Johannes was just saying and Joshua about the potential gaps and conditionality, I think that there are issues tied to the supply chain that are not legally or normatively within companies' remit, but would be very complementary to companies that are trying to act responsibly. And one would be working on ways to address open markets for artisanal minerals. And these are markets where it's really an opaque part of the supply chain because it's difficult to trace upstream of them. But they serve a really important market function as opposed to a closed pipe system where you have exclusive offtakes. They serve an important function because if a company is trying to make up a shortfall, they can go to the open market. Likewise, if upstream miners, even small-scale miners, they have excess production they can sell through the open markets. So they serve this important function, but it's sort of the problem of the commons. It's difficult to attribute responsibility for who's going to ensure that standards are being met or there's due diligence upstream of these markets. And the second issue is working on capacity building for governments, particularly on public financial management. I think often of the revenue, the potential public revenue from natural resources as similar to budget support in the sense that although it's not an aid modality, it is likely unforeseen public revenue that's not tied to any conditions. And so I think there's an opportunity to complement responsible sourcing policies by companies by trying to work with tax and other public authorities in the DRC, for example, recognizing that while there is corruption, it's not a unitary state, and there are no conditions that we can tie now to the revenue that is being made from these commodities. So why not get involved and work with those public sector counterparts who could make some progress on PFM?
I'm going to now open up for the floor to see if there are any questions. Please go ahead and please state your name and affiliation first.
Yeah, hi. My name's Greg with Tempe Salts.
Oh, there's a coming, sorry.
I run a small company called Pusamoy Consulting, and I do quite a lot of this due diligence research in East Congo and Kolwezi, and I've been doing it for years. So three points quickly. One about information challenges. Yeah, look, some information is easy to find, and some information isn't. Finding out that the general is the cousin of the politician who gave the permit, these kind of information is not available on the internet. And while I hear these blockchain initiatives to get information passed up through a blockchain, I think at some point you have to have specialist researchers who know what they're doing to get this information. It's not easy to get, and it takes time. The second point is about the point about whether child labour is really the main human rights challenge. I mean, just being in Kolwezi last week, another major issue, basically Kolwezi is sitting on a cobalt deposit. So you have residential areas that have got cobalt underneath them, and people have been digging up their own backyards. And the government is starting to relocate people. And the conditions of relocation and how it's done is a major human rights challenge. And I think there's real possibilities for downstream engagement. At the moment, because of this focus on child labour, the provincial and national government think that all people care about is child labour. So they only mitigate for that. But at the same time, they're not paying people properly, they're chucking them off their land, they're taking the money that should have gone to relocation, that kind of thing. So I think that's a human rights challenge. And finally, large-scale mining. Look, in the OECD due diligence, in the Annex 2 risk, they talk about corruption. Now, all the Bloomberg reporting on Congo has shown pretty conclusively that the large-scale miners have engaged in massive-scale corruption to get their assets. And I'm not seeing much interest from the downstream buyers from those companies in that issue. Instead, they like focusing on artisanals and child labour. One wonders if that isn't convenient.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to comment on that? There's another, Ben.
Sure, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there are a lot of blind spots when it comes to the different focus areas that have emerged, and I agree that, I mean, it's conversely, you could say, well, in the 3 Ts, all the attention was on conflict. But while we have a couple programs that have been supported on child labor, the vast majority of areas, there's no attention on resolving the child labor problem in 3 Ts. And that's just because there wasn't an amnesty report on that. So I definitely agree that the relocation, resettlement issue is really important in Kolwezi now, and I think that we need to take, I think the reason that we as PACT are involved in, particularly in ASM, is because we see it as critical to economic development, but in the same way, if LSM is going to be that source of economic development, we likewise need to put some attention on asset acquisition and corruption and taxation. So I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. Tony.
Tony Addison from UN Wider Helsinki. The DRC is, to put it mildly, an incredibly complex, fragile state, multiple problems. I'm wondering, are there any lessons to be learned in working from other countries that can be applied to the DRC, either in the sort of application of the human rights framework or more specifically at the project level, for example, what we know about getting child labour out of artisanal mining, what has worked in other countries, the relocation issue, which has just been raised, which is obviously a major one. So is there any international experience that we can bring to bear, and is it being brought to bear? I was a little bit worried about, I think you mentioned microfinance projects, which can have a fairly variable track record. That sort of the tide has gone out a little bit on microfinance, although there is still some very good stuff in Bangladesh. So that was my question.
Any examples you can think of? Joshua?
I'm going to try and go first. So I think, something that has always been interesting for us is this kind of intersection and level of cooperation between the state and the private sector, right? Specifically in instances where the context is quite complex. I think one thing that we have learned when engaging with companies from regions like the DRC and some others in Africa is that there shouldn't be an over-reliance on this relationship between the company and the state. I think what I mentioned earlier about the private sector kind of taking some responsibilities into their own hands as opposed to only doing what the law requires, I think that is a big major point that always comes out of these conversations. Which again places a burden, I know, on the private sector because they need to get this information that we've talked about a couple of times today. They need to be very much aware about some of the consequences of the things that they could be doing as opposed to only following the letter of the law. So I think that's really one thing that stands out is this idea that companies should be very aware of what their own obligations are, human rights obligations included, and then make sure that they comply with it without relying on the state to tell them to do so or when they're doing it. The second question, what you mentioned something else, I think.
Microfinance?
The microfinance, oh yeah. So again, against this backdrop of lessons to learn, so you all probably know about the Marikana incident that happened in South Africa a couple of years ago in 2012, where the miners were shot and killed by security forces, etc. So an interesting study that came out of that whole situation was around microfinance actually. And the role that microfinance played in the build-up of the conflict before the actual labor protest happened. And there's a very interesting study done in that regard by the University of Pretoria where I work about that could have been potentially avoided, and again, how that happened. So I'm happy to share that maybe with organizers or the people in the audience, but there's definitely some interesting lessons to learn about how microfinance could potentially contribute to conflict in a certain area and how that could potentially be avoided.
Johannes, please.
Yeah, maybe just one more point regarding that lessons learned from other countries question. What we haven't, just quickly want to throw that in, what we haven't really talked about at all is the role of civil society in the entire space, right? But if you look into Latin American countries, obviously what the game changer is there is a very strong and very self-confident civil society that is really pressing at the doorsteps of mining companies and reminding them every single day what their obligations are, right? So we have a completely different situation there, and it also leads to a political bias, unfortunately, because then, if you have a big, if you're like, let's go with Vale because we have that recent example. It's an easy target, right? You have a massive international mining company with a big brand, and building your advocacy campaign on that brand is a fairly easy thing to do, which then in consequence leads to the fact that small-scale mining on gold, where hundreds of people die every year still, is getting completely overlooked. And again, so I don't even want to say that's it is always a good thing, but obviously in Latin America it has changed the game completely. And if that would happen in the Copper Belt, we would be talking about a completely different set of challenges there.
Ben, is the DRC so unique that there are no lessons learned from other projects?
No, but it is very unique. I think, I mean, interestingly, since the preponderance of our programming, our mining program is in DRC, we often find ourselves in a position thinking, well, if we could do it there, we could do it somewhere else. But there is an interesting example related to human-centered design that we did in Myanmar recently, where we're working on in a gold mining community. We were very conscious of the risk of mercury poisoning, and we went in essentially expecting that this this project in the community, this research, would find that mercury was indeed the top of everyone's concerns, but it actually wasn't. But when you went through their list of concerns, eventually, once you related it back to the cause, it did usually in some way relate to mercury. And I think the lesson to be applied, certainly in DRC related to child labor, but I'm sure elsewhere, is that there isn't, I mean, most of the child labor is not being carried out in a malicious way. It's a part of people's lives, it's a necessity in some way, and so I think the way to raise people's awareness, kind of penetrate their mindset around this issue, is to look at the other ways that child labor or other issues that share the same causes are impacting their lives, and to be able to relate them together, and as a result find a point of entry to resolve that issue. It can't just be, well, this is against the law or this is bad. You have to find a way that it impacts some other parts of people's lives.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions. Gentleman in the back, please.
Yeah, Jeff Elzinga, Global Affairs Canada, and I'm in the National Resource Governance Division. I have some questions for the panel because, of course, one of the things that we're looking at in Canada, we've just signed a whole round of free trade agreements, and all of them, including whether it's with the EU, TPP, the new USCMA replacing NAFTA, they all have chapters on supply chain verification. And I'm just wanting to get your feedback on some of the challenges. I mean, we've done our internal analysis on some things, and as you mentioned, when you start to get into higher levels of manufacturing and how metals and minerals feed into that, it becomes very, very complicated. And if you look at what we have available as tools, which is things like the fair trade mark, or blockchain, which, in both of those examples, the economic models require payment for the verification. And even within the commodities themselves and with suppliers upstream and downstream, the costs of hiring auditors to verify with each and every supplier to check up on them is an added cost of business. And I'm just wondering what you see as being the way forward to both be comprehensive and cost effective, so that we're not just focusing on a couple of boutique issues, but we also have a way that governments can work with businesses and communities on the supply chain and have a guarantee as things move on a global market.
What a great question. Any takers? Ben?
Sure, thanks for the question. I think, first of all, not all solutions are going to fit every supply chain, but I think, and particularly when you think about traceability, often due diligence is sufficient, especially if it's a very diffuse supply chain. I think that some of the answer lies in multi-stakeholder, industry-wide initiatives. And I think that part of it is also about the business case. So in the case of artisanal mining in cobalt, we are working on a kind of field guide for mine operators. And this is it's aligned with CRAFT and with OECD. And I think that when you look at the potential, of course, not all supply chains rely on artisanally mined minerals, but I think there is a strong business case to be made that there's a place for ASM in many supply chains across many minerals, because it takes relatively little upfront investment compared to LSM operations. It's more flexible than LSM, it's more resilient to supply chain disruptions. And so I think there could be a role for public institutions, international institutions, to help to assist industry in setting up initiatives where they can pool their resources, develop their own operating guides, and ultimately with a business and human rights case in mind.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, great answer. I guess the only thing that I can contribute is to say that I think when you're faced with a big dilemma like this, one shouldn't immediately think that you have to reinvent the wheel. I think there's a lot of good materials and tools out there. Some that immediately jump to mind, some of our partners, such as the SHIFT project that's based in the US, I know I've done some work around creating toolkits exactly for these purposes. The Danish Institute for Human Rights, for example, the National Human Rights Institute of Denmark, they've done some good work around this. So, I know this is not incredibly helpful, but I would definitely advise people facing these issues to go look at those tools first and see whether they maybe address some of the concerns that you have, and if not, then you take up the conversation with maybe the same people to say, listen, we think that a toolkit that could be applied to certain things like free trade agreements or whatever would be useful. So I think there's a lot of civil society as well as consultancy groups, as well as those kind of straddling the line between the two, that would be very open to working with Canadian government and some of those to try and come up with these tools and materials.
Can I try one more? Yeah, I think the answer might not even be specific tools or instrument or methodologies that you can apply, but the answer might actually be a cultural change that happens over time. I do thoroughly think that there is a business case for projects that run sustainably. And that given that the consumer behavior does change in Europe and I believe in Canada as well, and that more emphasis is given towards fair trade products, for instance, I think that this will translate over time into a set of values that will be embedded somewhere in the industry. And I mean, I don't want to sound too futuristic, but maybe we don't need that organic stamp on vegetables anymore at some point. Maybe that will actually be the standard. I think that might be years ahead or decades ahead, but I think this is the way that it could work.
Yes, please. Final question. Oh. You're back.
Sorry. Shouldn't have put it down so quickly. Thanks very much to the panelists. I'm Nada Ogier with the Commonwealth Secretariat. And just building on the issue of traceability, and also tying into the broader human rights, where I agree with the view that ultimately it should be embedded within the various legislative instruments, and there's a legal obligation. A lot of the work that's been initiated, the Dodd-Frank Act was a catalyst for that, and we're changing winds, so to speak, on that front. One thing I like the views from the panelists is whether or not they believe, given the burden to companies on voluntarily complying with a lot of things, what are your concerns around if there's any step back from that front? And another is around, in terms of when we think of the source of a lot of these minerals, and in particular for developing countries, where we have a lot of activities on the mining front. What do the panelists see in terms of enabling frameworks, in particular with traceability, that can be put in place at national level to actually help facilitate a lot of this? So looking at it from the mine source and the role of governments in terms of furthering this responsible supply chain management.
Thanks a lot for the question. I think, well, interestingly, in the case of the DRC government has actually adopted OECD guidance into national law. So that's, I think, one of the only examples of real traceability. I mean, technically it's it's a mix of due diligence and traceability being adopted into a national legal framework. I think that in terms of the burden for industry, it's the issue with, I mean, while in some sense we're grateful that Dodd-Frank has focused the energies of the supply chain in order to get to the place we are now in the DRC regarding conflict-free minerals. I think one of our concerns, though, is that 99% of the costs of the upstream due diligence is borne by upstream industry. The downstream, while obviously it has a role in the smelter audits, is not, for the most part, playing an active role in financing those costs that are borne upstream, which puts countries, some countries like the DRC, at a competitive disadvantage. There might be some relief to that with the EU legislation, which is broader, but because it focuses on a more specific segment of the supply chain, it might not have exactly the same effect. So I think you kind of have to, when you're looking at it from a do no harm perspective, and you consider the initial de facto embargo that the DRC was under when Dodd-Frank initially was enacted, legislation can be tricky and can have unintended consequences. So I'm not exactly sure that we should continue to legislate due diligence and traceability per se, but I think that there is certainly a place in international agreements as well as in private contracts to hold counterparts to the norms, particularly OECD, that exist.
Joshua.
Yes, so I won't say anything about the traceability question, but maybe focusing specifically on what you mentioned about the burden of voluntary compliance with some of these things. So if you speak to the folks in the business human rights space, you tend to usually get a group of people that's very upset about this idea of voluntarism, voluntariness of some of the debates around this, and what you call binding, right? So it just against the backdrop of the conversations in the UN, there's currently, some of you might know, but there's currently a push for a treaty on business human rights at the United Nations that would shift this conversation from one that is, in the last few years at least, being embedded in this language of voluntary approaches to more binding approaches, right? Like the legal, binding, and stronger approaches. I think a lot of the frustration in the context of that conversation stems from what many consider to be this kind of inherent contradiction, right? Because we say that the things that we've been discussing today are legal obligations, yet we have so many voluntary guidelines and principles and sets of standards and so on that companies can comply with if they so wish or choose to do, right? Which highlights this weird contradiction, because a legal obligation is not something that you're supposed to be able to choose to comply with or not. I mean, it is required by the law. I mean, one can talk about this all day, but what I will say is that I think it's critically important for companies to distinguish between what is actually voluntary and over and beyond the legal obligations within a specific jurisdiction, and what is, not voluntary, what is binding with real legal and other consequences. And then to try and distinguish between the two. Because I think a lot of the frameworks that are posited by many to be voluntary in its nature actually contain some real and explicit legal obligations that one should comply with. And you run great risks if you look at those from a voluntary perspective.
Thank you. And actually, our time is now up. Jonas, I want to open up to you if you want to say a few finishing words or no? You good? Okay. Well, a big thanks to our panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion. Some of the takeaways from my side is that this energy transition is moving forward with full steam ahead. This responsible sourcing, whether it's cobalt or something else that we haven't yet discovered, is going to be the focus of attention. We're going to continue this conversation. I think the unusual actors coming together, that has been one of the things that popped up here and there, and something that I think we will have to continue talking about and coming together to improve the supply chains. But with that, I want to say a big thank you and round of applause.